Quantum Detective is an interactive fiction murder mystery. In the game, superposition is represented with temporal multiplexing. Here the variation of the various injuries to the body is shown. What would be the classical states are shown on the screen in proportion to their measure, not that they are called that within the game. The approach is rather that the strong stereotypes associated with these kind of stories help the player to make sense of the non-explained parts. The player encounters colorful characters, at least in font. To the identical questions, some versions of the characters will respond differently. These differences let it slip that something is amiss. They are also correlated with each other, enabling the player to paint a coherent picture behind each one. So while both the butler and the history teacher might be suspect, when the butler did it, the history teacher didn't do it, and when the history teacher did it, the butler didn't do it. Hopefully this gives a chance to build correct intuition about entanglements. Beyond the game gen version, there are now more analogous situations to various things, such as the bomb tester. This is not mere descriptive content, but the engine can now create more worlds and annihilate to get less. So beam splitters are genuine game objects. Here is a demonstration of quantum tunneling. Every launch, 10% of the remaining measure passes through the wall. In a realistic situation, it would also tunnel back, but here everything that has gone through the wall stays there. While most of the game the player character is coherent, here it is subtly not. You can't launch a box you don't have, so that version of the player needs to do something else. The game is designed that the player can assume that they are walking around in a classical world, but in fact the player is controlling all of the versions of the characters simultaneously. The game has the style that it does not brief with theoretical concepts. Rather, the goal is that the player can have some experience, and when reading Wikipedia articles or reading through the theory books, they have some experience to fall back on and apply that thing, making the theoretical text open up more easy. Quantum Woo is lessened by having enough references to make connections, but not enough that it turns into technobabble. For basic dialogue capacities, the game uses the ink language. So here is how the game expresses a Schrödinger's cat kind of situation. We set a variable and then call split world, which is a Hadamard gate analog. Later on, just using it as a regular bool variable means that via linearity and the engine spooling up the appropriate amount of story instance, the quantum state is constructed from the classical states. While the quantum stuff is rebuilt from the ground up, it should be fully analogous to quantum computing. So even if it's not apparent in the human approachable form, it should be pretty applicable to the actual math. Trying to postpone the math as long as possible teaches the constructor where the math is actually needed. This setup was also written from the point of view of singular classical tracks. For example, with Hadamard, this means that the zero state splits into two versions, and then separately the one version splits into two versions, and then there's a combination step where annihilation happens with things with opposite complex phases. And this is the only bit where complex numbers are needed. So there's a healthy dose of memes and colorfulness to make people easier to approach the mystery of quantum mechanics. This might be also a jumping off point for a high level quantum language, or somebody who wants to write quantum stories but is not so versed in math.